The paper trail is very, very important to investors. How long the due diligence process might take, it could take anywhere. On the short side, in some cases, the buyer is also going to want to know whether or not there's a threat of a lawsuit. So you present to the buyer. The next thing that the buyer is going to want to know is intellectual property due diligence. You can present the investor with an email saying, click here to see all of the financial history of the company up to the current date. Click here to see the corporate structuring history of the company, for example. Hello, entrepreneurs, startups, and investors. Welcome to another episode of Tip Top Startups. I am your host, David Nima. I am one of the top trademark and technology attorneys in the country. And in today's episodes, we're going to be discussing the checklist before buying a business. So we're going to talk about the kind of considerations that you need to think about before even going into a mergers and acquisitions deal, what happens during the mergers and acquisitions process, as well as the timelines that you want to think about and how long the whole process might take. Okay, so we're going to just dive right in. One of the first things that you want to think about before buying a business or thinking about buying a business is the industry in which you're purchasing into. Okay. Now there's a variety of reasons why you might select a certain industry. Let's say, for example, you want to get into the restaurant business, or you're thinking about buying a restaurant, or maybe a restaurant chain, for example, or maybe you're thinking about buying a video game publisher, right? Maybe you're thinking about buying an existing software service. Or maybe you're just thinking about buying your typical mom and pop dry cleaning business, right? So whether it's a traditional business or a digital new media business, the industry in which you're coming into, I think, is a primary consideration. You want to think about the longevity of the industry. You want to think about where is this industry going, for example, in the next 5-10 years. There's also other considerations, such as whether or not you are personally interested in the industry and you think that it's something that you can, work in all day, for example. For example, some people may not like sanitation. They just don't like it. Other people may not mind it and make a lot of money getting into the sanitation industry. So the industry that you're getting into is very, very important. In other cases, you may already be in the industry in which you're buying into. So this is almost a horizontal play in terms of your expansion into the current industry. And that's probably where most mergers and acquisitions happen. Nevertheless, there are occasions where a company is being sold to a buyer who is new into the industry. So that's certainly something that you want to take a look at. The next topic we want to talk about is the type of items or materials that go into the due diligence process, okay? So very quickly, of course, we're going to be talking about financials. Financials are going to be important. You're going to be disclosing certain financials to the prospective buyer during the mergers and acquisitions due diligence process. Next is entity status. The buyer is going to want to know that the company is well organized, it's formalized and formally organized, and all the entity, corporation, structuring, and formation and formalities are met in whatever state the company is organized in. Next, the buyer is going to want to know about legal liabilities. The buyer is going to want to know whether or not the company is currently in a lawsuit. Okay. Another thing they're going to want to know is whether or not there's a past judgment that's due. In some cases, the buyer is also going to want to know whether or not there's a threat of a lawsuit. So you may not even be in a lawsuit, but you may have received, for example, a cease and desist letter, and there's a threat of litigation. And you're going to have to disclose that during the due diligence process. So legal liabilities is certainly one of the most primary important areas that the buyer is going to be doing a lot of due diligence and investigation into. Next is the operations. How's the company being operated? Who are the principal players? And whether or not, the company is being smoothly operated and legally operated. So these are some of the things that you want to take a look at before buying a business. And of course, if you're an entrepreneur, these are the basics that you want to make sure you get cleared up and you have them all. The paperwork is completely prepared and ready to present to the buyer. The next thing that the buyer is going to want to know is intellectual property due diligence. The buyer is going to want to know whether or not the trademarks of the company are adequately protected. The buyer is going to want to know whether or not any kind of patents or copyrights are adequately protected, and whether or not trade secrets are adequately protected as secret confidential information. So that's the other notion that you want to take a look at. In terms of how long the due diligence process might take, it could take on the short side is usually, I'd say, 45 days, and it could take as long as 9 months, depending on the complexity and whether or not any kind of situations arise during the due diligence process that might even delay the process even further. So the sweet spot is really, I think, 2 to 3 months. But nevertheless, it can definitely go as much as 6 months. That's not out of the ordinary. However, when you're looking at around the 9-month territory, there's a huge risk of the deal not happening because it's really being prolonged way too long. So that's kind of another element there in terms of the timeline. So what entrepreneurs can learn about kind of the mergers and acquisitions industry as they're innovating and hoping to get acquired or potentially exit in some type of M&A deal is that the paper trail is very, very important to investors. Now, of course, investors have to like you. They have to like the business. They have to see the profit motive, right? But as you can see, one of the first things, for example, that the buyer will look for is whether or not they like the industry, right? So, of course, that's going to be an industry that you've already selected, so that's irrelevant. But and then you can't do much in terms of likability, and you can work on your likability skills. But from a paperwork perspective, you want to make sure that your entity formation, your financials, your corporate documents, your financials, and your intellectual property are adequately documented, okay? So that you can present the investor with an email saying, click here to see all of the financial history of the company up to the current date. Click here to see the corporate structuring history of the company. For example, you may have started as an LLC, right, in Nevada, and now you're a Delaware C Corp. 3 years into the company, you converted your LLC to a Delaware C Corp. You want to document that paper trail and present it to the investor just so the investor knows that you've been documenting everything properly. Investors really, really care about this stuff, as well as intellectual property. Of course, that is almost a given in terms of protecting your trademarks, your copyrights, your patents, your trade secrets, and making sure that all the documentation and all those things, except for trade secrets, you would have registration responsibilities with the Copyright Office, with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office for your patents and trademarks. You'd have serial numbers and registration numbers, and you would present that to your investor, and the investor will work with their intellectual property team to do due diligence on the intellectual property portfolio and make sure it is adequate in terms of what they're purchasing into. So that's a little bit about the mergers and acquisitions process and how startups can start to think about that process even during the early stages. Of course, once you're in a deal, you're looking at roughly the 2 to 6 month time frame in order to be able to close the deal successfully. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe to Tip Top Startups on YouTube and Instagram. I am David Nima, author of Tip Top Trademarks and Tip Top Startups, 2 books that I think will tremendously help entrepreneurs think about due diligence and risk reduction strategy during the early stages of the company. I'll see you guys on the next video.